April 6, 1943. The sun was a merciless fire in the sky, its heat pressing down on the men below. The desert of North Africa stretched endlessly before them, its barren, cracked earth interrupted only by the silhouettes of rusted tanks and the dark, jagged peaks of distant mountains. The dry wind whipped up clouds of dust, stinging the eyes and making every breath a struggle. For the men inside the M1340 tanks of the Italian 132nd Armored Division, this was not just another day in the desert, it was a battle for survival. Sergeant Giovanni Moretti, commander of the lead tank in his unit, wiped the sweat from his brow as he sat hunched over the controls. He had been in this hellish landscape for months, fighting through endless skirmishes with the Allies, most recently the British. But this time, something felt different. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to him, like the heat itself. Today was supposed to be just another advance, another routine patrol, but Giovanni could sense it. Today, they were about to face something far more dangerous than they had ever encountered before. Giovanni, a man in his early 30s, was no stranger to the horrors of war. A soldier from Rome, he had enlisted in the army when he was barely 20, driven by patriotism and a sense of duty. He had risen through the ranks quickly, earning his place as a tank commander through grit and determination. But beneath the tough exterior, Giovanni carried a deep sense of responsibility for his men. They were not just soldiers under his command, they were his family in this desolate world. His crew had fought side by side with him through countless battles, and now as he peered through the thick dust and the trembling heat waves, he could feel the weight of their fate pressing heavily on his chest. "Everything ready, Giovanni?" asked Corporal Marco, the gunner, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the tank's engine. Marco was young, eager, and full of life, but Giovanni could see the fear in his eyes. The same fear he had seen in the eyes of so many men who faced the unknown for the first time. They had all been briefed about the enemy forces, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of battle. Giovanni nodded, though his own heart raced. "Stay sharp," he muttered, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "We don't know what we're up against today." Giovanni's tank was part of a larger force, about 30 M1340 tanks spread out across the arid desert. These were the backbone of the Italian Armored Division in the region, designed for speed and maneuverability, though their armor and firepower were far from ideal. The M1340 had a 47mm cannon, which could pierce the armor of most enemy tanks they had encountered, but the Sherman, the American tank that had recently entered the theater of war, was a different beast entirely. For months, the Italians had fought the British, but now the tide of war had shifted. The Americans were starting to push through, and their tanks, the Sherman M4, were far superior in terms of firepower and armor. Giovanni had heard the rumors, whispers of how the Sherman could destroy a tank like his with a single shot. It was faster, stronger, and better protected. The M1340, in comparison, was outdated and underpowered. The disparity in their firepower was enormous. Giovanni had learned the hard way that the desert didn't care about who was right or wrong, who was brave or scared. It only cared about survival, and today he knew that survival was not guaranteed. The tank jolted forward as the engine roared to life, the heavy treads grinding over the sand. Giovanni glanced over at his crew. Marco, the gunner, was adjusting the sights of the main cannon, his brow furrowed in concentration. In the loader's seat, Luca was preparing the ammunition, his hands working quickly and efficiently. Behind Giovanni, Luigi, the radio operator, kept an eye on the radio, waiting for any new orders. The men were silent, each of them feeling the weight of what was to come. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. It was the voice of their commander, Colonel Romano. "Giovanni," the colonel's voice came through, tense but steady. "We've received reports of American tanks in the area. They're advancing toward your position. You're to hold the line. No retreat." Giovanni's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The orders were clear: no retreat. But as he looked out across the desolate horizon, he could see nothing. No sign of the enemy. No dust clouds. No distant gunfire. Just the endless stretch of sand and rock. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rumble of his own tank and the faint sounds of the other tanks in the division. It was almost as if the desert was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Giovanni could feel his pulse quicken, a knot forming in his stomach. He had fought in many battles, but this one felt different. The enemy was no longer a faceless opponent. It was the Sherman, a tank that had already earned its reputation on the battlefield. And now, it was coming for him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the air grew thick with tension. Giovanni's tank rumbled forward, his mind racing with thoughts of the Sherman, its 75 mm cannon, its thick armor, its devastating firepower. He had heard the stories of how the American tank crews were veterans, battle-hardened and efficient. He knew that they were about to face something far beyond their capabilities. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Giovanni's senses were on high alert. Every movement of the tank, every whisper of the wind, every shift in the sand could be a sign of the enemy's approach. But still, there was nothing. Then a single shot rang out in the distance. The sharp crack of a Sherman's 75 mm cannon echoed across the desert, followed by the sound of sand and dirt exploding as the shell slammed into the earth. Giovanni's heart skipped a beat, and in an instant, his instincts kicked in. The enemy was close, closer than he had anticipated. The Sherman was no longer just a rumor, it was real, and it was here. The crew of Giovanni's M1340 braced for impact. The fear, the uncertainty, they all felt it, but there was no time to dwell on it. The fight was here. The moment had come. Giovanni's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the controls, the weight of his orders pressing down on him. "Stay focused," Giovanni whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "We survive this, or we die trying." He turned to his crew, his eyes locking with each of them, offering the briefest nod of reassurance. There was no turning back. The Sherman was coming, and they would have to face it head-on. In the distance, another shot rang out, this time much closer. The battle for North Africa was about to begin in earnest, and Giovanni Moretti knew one thing for certain. This would not be an easy fight. The rumble of the M1340's engine was the only sound that broke the eerie silence of the desert as Giovanni Moretti's tank moved forward, now creeping cautiously over the barren landscape. His senses were heightened, every shift in the sand, every gust of wind amplified in his mind. The shot he'd heard earlier had come from the direction of the American forces, and now it seemed as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the moment the battle would ignite. Inside the tank, tension was palpable. Giovanni glanced at his men. They were all experienced, battle-hardened soldiers, but even they could sense it. This wasn't just another engagement with the British or even the occasional skirmish with local forces. This was the real thing. The Sherman was coming. Beside Giovanni, Marco, the young gunner, was fidgeting nervously. His fingers drummed against the edge of the gun controls, his eyes darting back and forth across the horizon, as if trying to catch a glimpse of the enemy that was still out of sight. Marco had joined the tank corps as a fresh recruit just over a year ago. His energy and optimism had once been infectious, but today Giovanni could see the fear in his eyes. This was not the kind of fight Marco had signed up for. "Giovanni," Marco spoke, his voice shaky, "do you think we can take them? The Sherman, it's a beast." Giovanni's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had heard the same rumors that Marco had. Everyone in the division had. The Sherman was a formidable opponent, and no matter how much Giovanni wanted to reassure his crew, the truth was far more complicated. The M1340 had a small chance. If they could get close enough, if they could use the desert terrain to their advantage, they might stand a chance. But deep down, Giovanni knew this wasn't a fair fight. "We don't have a choice, Marco," Giovanni said quietly. "We hold the line. For Italy, for our men." Marco's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he nodded, his face set with grim determination. Giovanni could see the boyish hope in his eyes slowly being replaced by the cold reality of battle. Marco had never truly experienced combat like this, and now it was all coming at him, hard and fast. Behind Giovanni, Luca, the loader, slammed the hatch shut and secured the ammo. The young man was silent, but Giovanni could feel his presence. Luca had been in the army for just over 3 years, but he had seen enough fighting to know how quickly things could turn. He was a practical sort, one who focused on the task at hand, but the sense of foreboding in the air was undeniable. "Everything's ready," Luca muttered, his voice low but steady. We just need to see where they are. Giovanni gave a brief nod, but his mind was elsewhere. He felt the weight of command pressing down on him. His men trusted him, but there was a part of him that wondered if he was leading them to their deaths. The orders had been clear: hold the line. But the moral dilemma gnawed at him. He had promised his men that they would not retreat, but with the Shermans' overwhelming firepower, was this really a fight they could win? Was he sacrificing his crew for the sake of an impossible order? At that moment, Luigi, the radio operator, spoke up, his voice cutting through Giovanni's thoughts. Commander, I'm picking up something on the radio. It's from the 3rd Division. They've spotted Shermans up ahead. A whole platoon. Giovanni's heart skipped a beat. The reports were becoming more frequent, and they painted a grim picture. The enemy was advancing, no longer a distant threat, but a very real and immediate one. Giovanni's mind raced. They had no reinforcements, no backup. It was just his crew, this one tank, against an entire platoon of Shermans. Is it confirmed? Giovanni asked, his voice tense. Confirmed, Luigi replied, his voice strained. They're coming straight for us, Giovanni. We won't have time to reposition. The weight of the situation settled like a leaden block in Giovanni's chest. There was no escaping this. He looked out at the barren desert, the rocky outcroppings and the endless stretch of sand. The terrain that had once been an ally, offering cover and concealment, now felt like a trap. There were no good places to hide, no escape routes. It was either fight or be destroyed. Marco, unable to keep his anxiety in check, leaned forward, his hand gripping the gun controls tightly. Giovanni, do you think we can outmaneuver them? We have the speed on our side. Giovanni glanced at Marco, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wanted to believe that too, but the Sherman was faster than his M13, and its cannon could tear through their armor with brutal efficiency. Giovanni had heard the reports from soldiers who had fought the Americans before, how the Sherman could fire with pinpoint accuracy, how its shells could punch through Italian tanks like paper. The difference in firepower was staggering. Even if they outmaneuvered the Sherman, the chances of surviving a direct hit were slim. We'll try to get close, Marco, but don't expect miracles. We'll fight as best as we can, but we might not come out of this alive. Giovanni could feel the tension building in the confined space of the tank. His men were listening closely, waiting for a sign, for something that would give them hope. But there was none to be found. The fear was tangible now, and Giovanni could feel it gnawing at the edges of his resolve. His hands were clammy on the steering wheel, his mind racing. What if he was leading his men to certain death? What if his stubbornness, his unwillingness to retreat, was a mistake? As the minutes ticked by, a sudden, sharp sound pierced the stillness. The crack of gunfire in the distance. The Sherman's 75mm cannon had fired. Giovanni's heart lurched. He glanced out at the horizon, searching for the source of the shot. There was nothing. Only the rolling desert, the fading light of the sun, and the mounting tension. Giovanni, they're getting closer, Marco said, his voice strained. We won't last much longer. Giovanni didn't need Marco to tell him that. He could feel it too. The Sherman was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every second felt like an eternity. He turned to his crew, his eyes hardening. We hold the line, men. No matter what happens, we hold the line. We fight until we can't fight anymore. The words were meant to rally them, to give them something to cling to, but Giovanni knew the truth. The battle ahead was a fight they might not survive. The Sherman had them outmatched, outgunned, and outclassed. But still, there was no retreat, no turning back. The tank continued its slow crawl through the desert, the tension thickening with every passing second. Giovanni's thoughts were a swirl of doubts and decisions, but in the end, one thing remained clear. They were about to face the hardest battle of their lives, and there was no way out. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in an eerie twilight glow. The desert, usually lifeless and quiet, now hummed with an oppressive tension. Giovanni's M1340 rumbled across the sand, its engine a low growl beneath the mounting silence. The rumble of the engine, the sharp sounds of the crew shifting in their seats, the hiss of the sand through the air. It all seemed to grow louder as the seconds ticked by. Giovanni's thoughts were a whirlpool of uncertainty. The battle was closing in. His men were on edge, waiting for the inevitable clash. The Sherman tanks were somewhere out there, lurking, their presence a constant weight on Giovanni's chest. Each time the radio crackled, his heart would jump. More reports of American tanks, more whispers of their advancing force. The feeling in the air was thick with something far worse than fear. Resignation. "Giovanni," Marco spoke up, his voice strained. "We can't keep this up. We're running out of time." Giovanni looked at his young gunner, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Marco had seen combat, yes, but this was different. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was the fight for survival. The M1340 could barely hold its ground against the Sherman, and with every passing moment, Giovanni felt the pressure of their situation intensifying. "We're not running out of time," Giovanni replied, his voice firm but hollow. "We hold, we fight. We can't give up. Not yet." But Giovanni's words felt empty even to him. The Sherman was coming, and there was no way to outrun it, no way to outgun it. They were too slow, too outclassed. Giovanni's mind raced, the options weighing heavily on him. They could try to retreat, but that was a death sentence too. The Sherman would catch them, fire at them from a distance, and destroy them with impunity. If they held their ground, they might last longer, but the inevitable felt all too real. He could already see the twisted wrecks of M1340 tanks in his mind, burned husks lying in the desert like the remains of the lost. The Sherman had the firepower to wipe them out with a single shot. They were trapped. The radio crackled again, cutting through his thoughts like a blade. "Giovanni," came Luigi's voice, tight with anxiety. "I've got something on the radio. There's no doubt now. They're here. The Sherman tanks. They've already made contact with the 3rd Division." Giovanni's heart sank. The moment was here. They had no more time for strategy, no more time for thinking. The Sherman was closing in on them, and their fate would soon be sealed. But there was still one thing they could do, one final, desperate choice. "Prepare yourselves," Giovanni said, his voice low. "We fight. No matter what happens, we fight." His crew fell silent, their faces drawn, filled with the stark realization of what was coming. They had all heard the stories, the rumors about the Sherman, about how it could rip through their armor like paper. They had trained for many battles, but this was different. This was the reckoning. As the M1340 continued its slow crawl through the desert, Giovanni's thoughts turned inward. The crew had entrusted him with their lives, with their safety. But how could he protect them when the enemy was far stronger, far more deadly? How could he lead them into a fight they were almost certain to lose? "Giovanni," Marco said again, his voice almost pleading, "if we keep going like this, we're all going to die." Giovanni felt his insides twist at Marco's words. His young gunner was right. The odds were stacked against them. They could try to run, but the Sherman would catch them. They could fight, but the Sherman would eventually destroy them. The desert felt like a vast trap closing in on them, and there was no escape. As Giovanni wrestled with his thoughts, something unexpected happened. A sudden, sharp crack split the air, and then the deafening roar of a Sherman's cannon echoed across the desert. Giovanni's heart lurched. The battle had begun. A shell tore through the air, smashing into the sand just meters from their position, sending a plume of dust and debris flying into the air. The shockwave rattled the tank, throwing Giovanni and his crew forward. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and Giovanni could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. "Return fire!" Giovanni barked, his voice sharp with adrenaline. Marco's hands moved quickly, the gunner's sights adjusting. They fired back, the M1340's cannon roaring as the shell sped toward the Sherman. The round hit the enemy tank with a resounding thud, but it did little more than leave a small dent in the Sherman's thick armor. The Sherman returned fire almost immediately, and this time, Giovanni felt the impact deep in his bones. The world shook as their tank took the hit. The force of the blast sent Luca sprawling in the loader's seat, his face pale as he struggled to hold on to the ammunition. Giovanni's mind raced. They were barely surviving the first exchange of fire. This wasn't a battle they could win by force, but there was something else, a decision to make, a choice that would determine whether they fought to the bitter end or retreated into the night, hoping to survive. "Giovanni!" Marco shouted. "We can't take much more of this. We have to make a move, now! Giovanni's gaze flicked between his crew, his men, his family in this war. The Sherman's cannon fired again, and their tanks shuddered under the force. He looked out across the desert, the endless expanse of sand and rock offering no shelter, no hope. Their tank was slowing, the damage already beginning to mount. The Sherman was too strong, too fast. Giovanni, you have to make a decision. Marco's voice was frantic now. If we stay here, we die. If we run, we might survive. The weight of the moment bore down on Giovanni like a crushing vice. Every part of him screamed to retreat, to find safety, to preserve his men. But the orders were clear. Hold the line. He had promised them that they would stand together, no matter the odds. But in that moment, Giovanni realized the truth. He was leading them to certain death. The Sherman fired again, and this time, the shell struck just inches from Giovanni's seat. He could feel the heat from the blast, the shock wave rattling his bones. The tank was finished. There was no coming back from this. But even as Giovanni prepared to give the order to retreat, something in him resisted. He couldn't abandon his men. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. Stay in formation, Giovanni shouted, his voice full of resolve. We hold the line. His words were more than just orders. They were a rallying cry. Giovanni was making a choice, not just for his men, but for himself. This was the moment that defined a leader. The moment when the weight of responsibility became unbearable, but still, you pressed forward. The Sherman tanks were closing in. The sky above them darkened, and the wind picked up, swirling the desert dust in every direction. Giovanni's crew braced themselves, each man aware that this battle, this moment, could be their last. And then, in the distance, Giovanni saw it, the enemy advancing. The Sherman had them in its sights. There was no turning back now. The desert was now alive with the chaos of battle, the harsh, ringing sound of artillery fire echoing through the dry air like the roar of thunder. The M1340 tank jolted violently as another Sherman round struck its side. The world inside the cramped metal hull of the tank was a violent whirlwind. Every man fighting the instinct to panic, fighting the overwhelming sense that their time was running out. Giovanni Moretti gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he leaned forward, eyes fixed on the enemy ahead. The Sherman was almost upon them. The thundering impact of its cannon was all but deafening, and Giovanni felt his stomach twist. This wasn't the way it was supposed to end. Not like this. Not with his men dying in the sand. But as the Sherman fired again, Giovanni's thoughts began to clear. There was no time left for hesitation. The M1340 was barely functional now. Its treads were damaged, its cannon no longer firing with accuracy, and the once pristine steel exterior was now battered, riddled with bullet holes, and scorched from the heat of several near-miss explosions. They were sitting ducks. Giovanni knew it was only a matter of time before the Sherman would zero in on them, delivering the final, fatal blow. Giovanni, we can't take much more of this, Marco shouted from his seat, his voice trembling with the fear of a soldier facing inevitable death. We need to get out of here, now! Giovanni glanced at him, his own face pale but resolute. Marco's words were true. There was no longer any hope of winning this fight. They had tried. They had fired every round, every shot in their arsenal. But the Sherman's thick armor was impervious. They had no more ammunition. They had no more time. The desert had become their graveyard. But still, Giovanni hesitated. The weight of command pressed down on him. He had given his word, no retreat. The men under his command had trusted him to lead them, to protect them. How could he abandon them now, just as the enemy closed in for the kill? Another explosion rocked their tank, and Giovanni's body slammed forward into the controls. He gritted his teeth, forcing his mind back to focus. There was a way out. He had to find it, for the sake of his men. A voice broke through his thoughts. Luca, the loader, his voice strained but urgent. Giovanni, the engine's overheating. We're losing power. We can't move any faster. Giovanni cursed under his breath. The M1340 had been battered too much to keep going. The desert heat, the constant barrage of enemy fire. It was a miracle the tank had lasted this long. There was no escape. There was no way out. Hold tight, Giovanni shouted, his voice filled with determination. We're not done yet. He slammed the throttle forward, coaxing the damaged engine to life one last time. The M1340 lurched forward, but it was slow, sluggish, barely moving. It felt like the entire tank was screaming, every engine part and gear protesting as they struggled to keep up. Giovanni, please! Marco cried out again, his voice cracking. It's too late! The Sherman is coming! We're not going to make it! But Giovanni's mind was already made up. He could see it now. The Sherman's silhouette emerging from the dust, its turret rotating toward them, ready to fire. Giovanni's hands trembled on the controls, but he held fast. His crew needed him. His men were depending on him. Without warning, Giovanni turned the tank sharply, trying to use the terrain to block the Sherman's line of sight. The tank shuddered, groaned, and lurched with every move. But it didn't matter. They weren't running anymore. Giovanni wasn't going to die like this, not without a fight. He had made a promise to his men, to himself, that he wouldn't leave them behind. The Sherman fired once more, the shells screaming through the air toward them. Giovanni's eyes widened as the round flew directly at them. It was too fast, too close. His body tensed, bracing for the impact that would surely end it all. But then, a flash of movement. Another tank, smaller, faster, appeared on their left flank. The sound of gunfire rang out, and a Panzer IV shell slammed into the Sherman, forcing the American tank to retreat, its turret spinning wildly. The Sherman fired back, but the damage had already been done. The Panzer IV had made its move, and the Sherman was momentarily distracted. Giovanni stared in disbelief as the enemy tank pulled back, its crew clearly shaken from the sudden attack. The Panzer IV had given them a chance, a slim, fleeting chance to escape. Go! Giovanni shouted, slamming his hand on the radio. Luca, get us out of here, now! With a grunt of effort, Luca pushed the damaged controls forward, and the M1340 lurched once more. Giovanni could feel the vibrations of the engine faltering beneath him, but for the first time, it didn't matter. They were moving away from the Sherman, moving away from certain death. But the desert had a price, and it would not let them go easily. The tank crept forward, barely making it over the dunes, the roar of the Sherman's engines still echoing behind them. But the M1340 was slow, far too slow to escape the attention of the enemy. Giovanni's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his heart pounding in his chest as he saw the shadow of the Sherman closing in. Just as Giovanni thought they might make it, just as hope surged in his chest, something terrible happened. The M1340's engine sputtered once more, the power cutting out in an instant. Giovanni's stomach sank. They had only a few moments before the Sherman would catch up and destroy them. Giovanni, no! Marco's voice was raw with panic. We're dead! We need to do something now. The words cut through Giovanni's mind like a knife. He couldn't let his men die like this. He couldn't let them die because of his decision. Get out! Giovanni shouted, his voice hoarse and filled with urgency. Everyone, get out, now! Without hesitation, he threw open the hatch, climbing out of the M1340 as quickly as he could. The heat of the desert burned against his skin, but there was no time to feel it. He had one last chance to save his men, one last chance to make the impossible choice. Go! I'll cover you! Giovanni yelled to Marco, Luca, and Luigi. The words felt like a death sentence, but there was no other way. He would stay behind. He would buy them time. As the crew scrambled to escape, Giovanni glanced back at the Sherman, its engines roaring as it closed the distance. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to hold them off, even if it meant sacrificing himself. The Sherman was closing in, its turret trained on him. Giovanni's heart beat like a drum in his chest as he took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. His men had a chance, and he would give everything to make sure they had a future. The first shot from the Sherman tore through the air, and Giovanni braced himself for the inevitable. This was his moment of truth. The battle was over for him, but it had just begun for his men. The deafening roar of the Sherman's cannon still echoed in Giovanni's ears as he watched his men scramble to escape the tank. His body was frozen in the moment of sacrifice, his decision already made. There was no turning back. He had given everything for them, the chance to escape, to survive. But as the sound of their fleeing footsteps grew distant and the weight of the battlefield settled around him like a suffocating blanket, Giovanni couldn't shake the feeling that he was already lost. The M1340 had come to a halt, its engine silent now, its twisted, smoking shell reflecting the harsh light of the dying day. The desert air, thick with the heat of battle, clung to him. Giovanni's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He didn't look back as the Sherman closed in. There was no need. His choice had been made, and now it was time to face the consequences. He could hear the faint sound of the Sherman approaching, the grinding of its treads, the low hum of its engines. In the distance, the unmistakable silhouette of the tank loomed, closing in on him. It would only take a moment before the Sherman fired again, and then he would be nothing more than a statistic, a casualty of war. Giovanni thought of his men, now safely out of the tank and running across the sand, desperately trying to find cover. He had done what he could, given them the best chance to survive. And yet the weight of that decision, of choosing to stay behind, to face certain death, pressed heavily on his heart. He had lived through countless battles, fought in countless skirmishes, but this felt different. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a test of his very soul. The Sherman came closer, its massive turret rotating toward him. Giovanni could see the enemy tank's crew, their faces set in grim determination. They had no personal animosity toward him, no reason to take pity. This was war, and war had no mercy. As Giovanni braced for the inevitable, a sharp pain pierced through his side. The Sherman's shell struck, sending a violent shockwave through his body, and everything went black. When Giovanni opened his eyes again, he was lying on the ground. The world around him was a blur of smoke, sand, and heat. He could barely move, his body aching with the shock of the blast. His thoughts were slow, heavy, but through the haze, one thought pierced his mind. Did they make it? The battle was still ongoing, the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions drifting on the wind. Giovanni tried to push himself up, but his body betrayed him, his arms trembling, weak from the blast. He managed to lift his head just enough to see the aftermath of the battle. His tank was no more than a burning wreck, its remains scattered across the sand. The Sherman had done its work, but somewhere, out there in the endless desert, Giovanni knew that his crew was still alive. They had escaped, and that was enough. That was the price of his sacrifice. As the hours passed, Giovanni lay on the ground, his body battered, but his mind still sharp. He could hear the distant sound of Allied vehicles approaching. He knew that he wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. His vision was fading again, the edges of his world blurring in and out of focus. But through the haze, he heard something. Footsteps, someone calling his name. He couldn't be sure, but it sounded like Marco. "Giovanni!" the voice called, urgent and filled with pain. "Giovanni, don't die! Don't leave us!" The words cut through the fog in Giovanni's mind like a blade. He tried to speak, to reassure Marco, but his voice wouldn't come. His breath was shallow and his limbs felt heavy, weighed down by the consequences of his choice. But he was at peace. He had done what he could. He had chosen to stay behind for them, to give them a chance at life. "Marco," Giovanni whispered hoarsely, the name barely escaping his lips. The last thing he saw before everything went black again was Marco's face, frantic, terrified, but alive. They had made it, and for that, Giovanni could rest. The aftermath of the battle was swift. The Sherman's victory had been assured, but Giovanni's crew had managed to escape the carnage, scattered across the desert in small groups, their lives forever marked by the loss of their commander. They were eventually rescued, though the cost was high. Many of them would return to Italy, wounded physically and mentally by the battle they had just fought. But none of them would forget what had happened, how Giovanni had given his life to give them a chance. In the weeks that followed, the Italian division continued to fight, but Giovanni's name was passed from one soldier to another, his story becoming a symbol of courage and sacrifice. He had not been a hero in the traditional sense, nor had he died on some glorious battlefield. But in the quiet moments between battles, when the weight of their losses became too much to bear, Giovanni's sacrifice lived on in the hearts of those he had protected. Giovanni's death was not in vain. His sacrifice had allowed his men to survive, to fight on for Italy. And in the grand scheme of the war, his story became one of countless untold sacrifices. Ordinary men who, in the face of impossible odds, chose to give everything for the lives of others. Historical note: Inspired by a true letter from 1943, written by an Italian tank commander who gave his life to protect his men during the Battle of El Alamein. His selfless act of sacrifice became a symbol of bravery for his unit and beyond.